Good morning. Welcome to Red Team Your Network. My name is George Frazier. I'm the Director of Information Systems for Lower Merion School District presently. I've been an IT Director in Education for 20 plus years. I do hold my CISSP. I'm also a GSNA. I've been in education in the classroom, and prior to education, I was in the Marine Corps. I was in the Marine Corps active duty for 4 years and then a following 6 for reserves. And I'll explain the relevance of that in a couple slides. So the goals of this presentation, just to introduce red teaming if you're not familiar with it, discuss covert channels, discuss how you can build a red team exercise around covert channels, look at some data sources for finding covert channels in your network if they're present, and take a look at some beginning steps that you can use to get started in red teaming and looking for covert channels in your own networks. Just a quick jargon alert, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. We hear a lot of things like vulnerability scan, penetration test, red team, blue team. There's even a purple team, but we're not going to get into that. Just to cover some of those things and how I use them, because there's even some confusion in the InfoSec community about what some of these terms mean. So a vulnerability scan, I use that to speak about an automated tool like Nessus, using Nessus to scan a network or scan a segment or scan a device. So that's pretty much an automated tool using signatures. A penetration test, now penetration testers may use a vulnerability scan, and many do to kick things off, but a penetration test, in again, my view of this, is testing something specific, like we're going to test a new app, or we're going to test a new firewall, or we're going to test a new server. Maybe the penetration test is much broader. We're going to test trying to access your network, or there's even social engineering penetration tests. We're going to start a phishing campaign to try to social engineer and get into your network that way. But it's more specific to testing either applications or configurations or whatever it is that you're asking to have tested. A red team, and again, there's not a lot of agreement, or I shouldn't say full agreement in the InfoSec community, but a red team is more about testing people. It's more about testing skills. It's more about skill building. So when I speak of a red team, I don't want to confuse that with a pen test or a vulnerability scan. A red team is more about looking at the skills of the folks in your departments, or looking at the skills of maybe even an outsource that you've hired. So when talking about a red team, I suggest you try to answer or finish the following sentence. The red team's goal is to make the blue team better at. So what do you want to make the blue team better at? So the blue team is the defenders. So you're probably thinking like, well, I don't exactly have a blue team, and who's my red team? You wear all those hats. And we'll go through some ideas for that. Now, the idea of red teaming is not new. And like a lot of jargon in our industry, it's been borrowed from the military. So I had mentioned in the introduction, I had spent some time in the Marine Corps. And this was a long time ago, okay, starting 1988. We were doing red team exercises back then. We were called OPFORD, or Oppositional Forces, or Red Team. And you might think that sounds like a military exercise, is just a bunch of Marines running through the woods shooting blanks at each other. Not at all. It was very much like I've described here. We had very specific things that we were supposed to do and test. So if you were the OPFOR, you were given very specific instructions on how to behave, or what to do, or where to move in order to test the blue team. So this concept is not new. It's actually pretty old. And even back then in the military organization, it was about testing the skills of the blue team. So with that in mind, when you speak about red teaming, think about, well, what are the skills that I want to test or build in my defenders? And how do I craft an exercise that will test those skills or build those skills? Okay? All right. So the blue team, again, defenders, what's their role? Well, they're your incident response team. If something happens, these are the folks who are going to step up and try to address the situation and remediate the situation. So their role is to look at what your procedures are for an incident response. Look at sources of data. Look at the tools that they have and make sure that they know how to use the tools, and then gather the necessary supplies that they need for the red team exercise. And it can be simple. In one of our red team exercises, I had moved everybody into a conference room, and the defenders brought their laptops. Well, they realized that they were handicapped because they didn't have the large monitors that they use day to day. And they found that they were having trouble getting through data very quickly that they were familiar with because they didn't have the tools that they needed. And I should also suggest snacks. Sometimes these exercises can run for a long time, and it helps to keep things running smoothly. All right, so just to shift gears a little bit here, ask yourself what keeps you up at night. And I point that out because maybe that's the thing that you want to start thinking about building the skills of your team around. For me, what keeps me up at night is the idea of someone in my network roaming around inside of my network for a long period of time. That personally keeps me up at night. So what I have here is the Lockheed Martin kill chain. You may be familiar with this, but it goes through the steps that a persistent attacker may take in compromising your network. So we're not talking about commodity malware. We're not talking about ransomware or cryptoware or something that is introduced to your network that an antivirus can perhaps find and resolve. We're talking about someone who's persistent in trying to get into your network, who wants to get a foothold in your network. So we're talking about command and control, and just to give you some information about that, in this year's, the 2018 Verizon DBIR, and if you haven't read that yet, I suggest that you do, C2 was present in 19 out of every 100 breaches in education. So let's parse that a little bit. The word breach is significant. The word breach means that data was lost. Okay, it means data was lost when you use the word breach. So 19 out of every 100 breaches, meaning data was lost, C2 was present. Command and control was present. Again, keeps me up at night. Further back this up, the 2018 TrustWave Global Security Report, the median time that an intruder is in your network, if you don't discover it yourself, the median time is 83 days before an outside agency tells you that. Now think about that. So someone's been roaming around inside of my network, on average, 83 days before an outside agency calls me and says, hey, by the way, we think there's someone in your network. You might want to check that out. Okay, keeps me up at night. Okay, and again, that may be different for you. You need to think about what keeps you up at night. And then again, think about how can I test the skills, my team's skills, to try to remediate that type of situation. All right, so for me, it's command and control. So what are the goals of command and control? Well, and again, I said it's a persistent attacker wants to get a foothold on your network. They want to get in your network. Now, for what reason, it may vary, okay? But we know that once they get into your network, they're going to try to gather information. They're going to try to gather credentials. They're going to start moving laterally across your network, compromising more machines. If they find data that they can use, they'll exfiltrate that, all right? Or they'll start moving to find other devices that they can use for their own gain. Brian Krebs, he has a couple pretty good pieces on what criminals do with devices that they compromise. So if you want to read a little bit more about what's the value of compromised machines, I would suggest taking a look at Brian Krebs. Okay, so what is command and control? All right, again, for me, it's how would I know that someone is using command and control? All right, so these are the questions. Like this slide is really some internal dialogue that you're looking at. So how would I know if I had a compromised machine in my network? What if it wasn't triggering some antivirus alert? How would I know that there's something in my network? What logs could I use? What logs could I start collecting? Do I have any triggers, or do I have anything that's available to me to monitor for that? So I'm asking myself, how do I go about finding if something is in my network? I don't want to be contacted on average 83 days after someone is in my network calling me to tell me that someone's in my network. How can I do that myself? Okay. So before we go any further, I just want to take a quick refresher on firewalls. And this is a definition of firewalls from Cisco. All right, so not to read it to you, but it's a device that monitors incoming and outgoing traffic. Keyword, outgoing. So let's take a look. Oh, I'm sorry, another jargon alert. So when I refer to north of the firewall or outside of the firewall or ingress filtering, I'm talking about the side of the firewall that faces the internet. When I talk about south of the firewall, inside the firewall, or egress filtering, I'm talking about the side that faces your network. Okay, so outside, inside, north, south, ingress, egress. So let's take a look at, and again, this is a firewall refresher for many of you. So most often we think of ourselves as I'm on my laptop, I'm on my computer, and I want to go to a web page. So we type in HTTP or HTTPS, whatever the case may be, and our request goes into the internet and eventually, hopefully, lands on a firewall first, okay? And that firewall will say, you know, what port are you trying to go to? Oh, you're trying to go to 80 or 443. I have that open. You can go, and it forwards your request to a web server that says, I'm listening on 80 and 443. Here's what I have to offer, okay? Pretty simple example. The blocking is true. Remember, we said it's monitoring traffic. So someone's trying to get to an SMB share, 445. All right, that should land on that same firewall, and the firewall should say, nope, sorry, but I don't allow 445, and turn that request away. All right, so pretty simple examples. Now, the firewall, when we're on the inside of the firewall, now those two slides were outside. Now, when we're on the inside of the firewall, most of our firewalls are stateful. At least I would believe that all of them are stateful at this point. And that means that the firewall is remembering your request so that it will let it back in. Now, when you're inside the firewall, unless it's been configured for egress filtering, will honor and let you access all 65,000 TCP ports and will let you use all 65,000 UDP ports. Most firewalls are not configured for egress filtering. So just make a mental note there, like, is my firewall configured for egress filtering? If you know it is, great. Okay, if you don't know if it is, it's something you want to check, because in essence, what it's saying is, I'll let any port go out as long as it's coming from inside my network. And they're configured that way so that your request can come back. It knows to let your request back through the firewall. All right, so how are attackers taking advantage of this? How are criminals using this to their advantage? I send an email. Maybe it's got a malicious payload, and my firewall is certainly configured to let in email. 25, 110, 143. That email comes in. Maybe it goes through a spam filter. Maybe it goes through an antivirus on your mail server. User receives it, but that malicious payload makes it through to the user, and the user clicks it and opens a connection going out through the firewall. What do you think the firewall is going to do? It's going to let it right back in. Why? Because it's stateful. Because it's going to remember that that channel was open from the inside out. So when it's coming back in, it says, I remember you. Come on in. You're welcome to come back in because you started from the inside out. Now, it's usually about this point in a presentation that I start asking myself really? Does that really happen? Like, does someone really click the email? Does a channel really open up? Are they really able to pull something down that's going to create that C2 channel? Okay, this is where you start, you're looking for a reality check, right? So this is 2 weeks ago. Okay, this is 2 weeks ago, and this is an email that was received by 16 of my users. All right, so just take a second to take a look at that. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that there's a Word attachment. Okay, it's your typical spam look and feel. It's official confirmation. Please check the invoice. Update your stuff. It's shipping today. There's a sense of urgency. Pretty standard phishing attack. 16 of my users received it. What I cut off in taking this screenshot is a little bit further down in this phishing email. It had the word Staples. Staples. So my users were like, oh, this is from Staples. It must be real. Nothing else set off a radar, but it had Staples in it, so it must be real. Okay, so fundamentally, when you clicked on that Word document, that Word attachment, you were prompted to enter a password, and the password's in the body of the email, and you were presented with this. This was the attachment. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see there's two icons in the middle of it, and you're directed to download your invoice. Okay? 8 of my users made it to this point. 8 of my users made it to this point before they started thinking, I don't know that this is real. Okay? Fortunately for me, none of them opened it. Okay? Fortunately for me, none of them clicked on those icons. Okay? Because what those icons contain is a script that would reach out through my network, out to the internet, and pull back a banking Trojan. Okay, I had never heard of this before 2 weeks ago, but it was the Emotet banking Trojan, EMOTET, I think it is, Emotet banking Trojan. It would pull that back to their machines. Now, how could that happen? Exactly what I explained. The request is coming from the inside out. It would reach out, it would grab it, it would pull it back in. Now, hopefully the antivirus would have found that and prevented it from being launched, or even prevented it from getting to their machine once it landed on their machine. But you might be asking yourself, well, where was the spam filter? Like, why didn't the spam filter catch that? Like, why didn't your antivirus on your mail server stop that? Okay, legitimate questions that I was asking. And it was simply because it was a Word document that had been password protected. And our spam and our antivirus was, our antivirus was configured to let it go. If it was encrypted, it let it go. Obviously a configuration error, right? So now I'm blocking anything that's encrypted. All right? And again, make a mental note there. Like, what is our antivirus doing? Like, would our antivirus stop and check on an attachment on its way in if it's encrypted? So the user would unencrypt it by putting in that password. So So, and this isn't like a one-off. Coincidentally, the Internet Storm Center picked this same type of attack vector up, and there's an article about it that you can read, where attackers are using this type of attack more often, where they're getting malicious content through by password protecting it. The user just simply uses the password, opens it up, and then it's on their machine. So it's worth taking a look at. I share this with you because this same attack vector could easily be used to open up that command and control channel. It's just a different payload, right? So in this particular instance, the payload was a banking Trojan, but the payload could have just as easily have been something to open up a C2 channel. All right. I like quotes. This is a quote that I often think about. Prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. And I share that with you because we have a spam filter. We have antivirus. We have antivirus on our mail servers. We have antivirus on the endpoint. But criminals are constantly thinking of new and even simple ways to get to the endpoint, to get to the user. So as much as we like to think that everything we have in place is going to prevent it, and that's ideal, we have to think about detection. We can't just say we have antivirus, we're good. We have to think about detection too. All right, so what are some data sources that we can use for finding a C2 channel? Firewall, web proxy, DNS logs. The new Windows Server 2016 has more DNS logging capability. NetFlow, also called session data. If you're not familiar with NetFlow, I would strongly recommend you start to get familiar with NetFlow. And full packet captures, if you're permitted. Again, that's a policy type of thing. You want to check and make sure your policy permits you to do full packet captures. And you also want to make sure that you have the CPU and storage for full packet captures, because it gets very big very quickly. But these are some locations that you can use in your own networks for C2 detection. You also want to test those, okay? You know, when I get into conversations like this, and someone will say, our firewall's logging. Okay, what's it logging? Okay, what's it logging? If you're familiar at all with Cisco syslog, it's confusing and can be somewhat confusing to configure. Just as an example, the notification level in Cisco syslog will tell you if someone's trying to log into the firewall, for example. Okay, you have to kind of pull this apart to figure out what exactly is it logging, and then you have to ask yourself, is that logging of any benefit to what I'm trying to do? So a simple answer like the firewall is logging may not be everything that you need. Again, another quote. If you have something running in your monitoring program and you haven't tried it, you haven't tested it, you really don't know that it's going to work for you. Okay? If you've set like something like firewall logging, test and see what value those logs have for what it is that you're trying to do. Don't assume just because something's logging, it's going to work for you when you need it. All right. So our first red team, now to get into red teams. So our first red team, we wanted to practice our incident response. For example, event correlation. We wanted to be able to identify and contain compromised devices, locate compromised devices, identify the C2 channels, determine if there was any kind of lateral movement, and also we have a managed security service provider to see if they were able to detect it, to see if they were going to be able to alert on it. And that's another assumption. Like, we send our IDS logs, our firewall logs, we send a number of logs to a managed service provider, and we wanted to see, well, will these folks pick that up? Like, is that something that they'll be able to see? And we discovered that they didn't. that they didn't see what we were doing in this particular red team exercise. So I had mentioned that our objective was to practice our incident response. We adopted the SANS pickerel model for incident response. And you can see that here again. It's a good takeaway if you're interested in it. You should be interested in incident response. You should be working on an incident response procedure, and I would recommend this particular model for that. So just to give you a scope of the network that we were working in, my network has 8,500 students, plus students, greater than 1,900 employees. We have better than 14,000 devices on our network. So and that's just the network, and that's everything from security cameras through to iPads. So lots of devices on the network, and you can see we have it over 14 locations and 71 telecommunication closets. I share that with you because scale matters. Scale matters. Like, I certainly start, if you're completely new to this, certainly start in a lab, but don't assume that because you can do something in a lab, it's going to work for you at scale. Okay? It's, you turn on logging, you turn on like TCP dump or Wireshark or something like that in a lab, and you get, it's pretty impressive how much network traffic there is in a lab. But then you try turning it on in your networks, your work networks, it's overwhelming the amount of data that you start collecting per second. And all of a sudden you realize, well, how are we going to just move this around? And how are we going to parse this? How are we going to just open it? Wireshark will start to stall when you start to get into very large files. And the idea of opening it in Excel, good luck with that. So you need to start figuring out, like, how do I handle these things at scale? So start in a lab if you're not familiar with it, but I would continue to try to move into the scale of your network so that you know that those same skills and tools will work for you. Okay, so this first red team, our first red team, became known as the Land Turtle. How many people are familiar with Land Turtle? A couple few? Okay, all right. So it's the HAK5 Land Turtle, it's called. And I elected to pick up this device because my objective wasn't to learn Metasploit. My objective wasn't to learn Netcat. My objective was to build the skills of my team. I wanted to be able to create an environment rapidly and build the skills of my team. So this was a great device to help me move through what I needed to set up quickly in order to do that. So the Land Turtle, the HAK5 Land Turtle, comes with a number of modules, 20 pre-installed modules you can install. But the one that I was interested in, again, was C2, Command and Control. So the modules that I used in the Land Turtle for this were SSH, Netcat for reverse shell, and Meterpreter for Metasploit. So each one of those modules would allow me to open up Command and Control channel outside of my network. Okay? In order to do that, I needed something on the internet that would be able to communicate with the Land Turtle, which was inside of my network. So if you're familiar with DigitalOcean, you can buy a Linux server on DigitalOcean for as little as $5. So it's a great resource for having something to communicate to outside of your network. Just to touch on, we're all familiar with SSH. Netcat is a very small tool that works very well. It opens up raw connections. You can use it for communication. You can use it for file transfer. It pretty much gives you access, almost a shell, if you will, on a device. And Meterpreter gives, actually, you have a full shell with Meterpreter. And again, it wasn't my plan, it wasn't my intent to become skilled in these different tools. my intent of using the LAN turtle was to just be able to quickly move into a red team exercise. This is a screenshot of the configuration on the turtle. And it's very easy to use, very easy to set up. It fundamentally, just to go back a slide or two, it fundamentally looks like a USB Ethernet adapter. On the other side, you can see that there's an Ethernet port there. On the other side of it, it's USB. Just to set it up a little bit further, I knew that we have Raspberry Pis in our middle schools. We have a middle school coding club that meets after school. They use Raspberry Pis. We don't have them locked down like we can on a Windows machine or a Mac, so that the students can use them for coding development. So I knew I had a device that I could easily compromise in order to execute this exercise. So I used the LAN turtle, went into the library where they were located, and plugged the LAN turtle in. Because you can configure it ahead of time, it automatically started opening up those channels of communication outside of the network. So just to show you, try to give you a visual of that. So I took the LAN turtle, plugged it into that Raspberry Pi, outgoing 22, outgoing 4444, and 6666. I was trying to use port numbers that were pretty obvious. And it communicated out to the DigitalOcean Linux server. Sure enough, the firewall saw the traffic coming back. It said, yep, I remember you, come on in. And I had a communication channel open inside of my network from the DigitalOcean Linux server. And then from there, I was able to start ports, or I just started scanning laterally across the network. Take a look at this slide. You'll notice that now this is actually from a lab. This is me creating the connection in my lab, and you'll notice that there's two different connections there. The LAN turtle is on the left. That's the .24, and you can see the high ports, and it's connecting to 252 and .11, and you can see the port numbers there, 22, 444, 666. The reason why I had in this particular screenshot, the reason that an attacker would have different devices that it's connecting to is so that if the attacker loses one of the channels, it still has another channel open. So a smart attacker will have multiple channels open to multiple other external devices, so that if you find one, it can go and rely on another one that maybe you haven't found yet. So that was part of our red team. Part of our red team was try to figure out what it's connecting to and over what ports, and how many external connections there were. Here's actually, this is the interpreter shell, and I'm looking at the LAN turtle. So this is actually from the DigitalOcean box back inside, and I'm remoted in through the interpreter shell to the LAN turtle. So I'm remotely controlling the LAN turtle. And the LAN turtle comes with a fun little banner there that you can cat and see that you're connected to it. But once you're on there, you basically have a command line that you can start using it for however you want to. Okay, so the red team, the Hak5 LAN turtle, we kicked off the red team. Now I had already, at this point, I had already configured the LAN turtle, the DigitalOcean box. I had already thought through where I wanted to put it. I went to it was one of our middle school libraries. I went into the lab. I connected the LAN turtle. As I said, it's configured to automatically start and create those command and control channels, and I was able to see that it had connected to the external server that I had. The day that we picked to do this was a day that we knew that we didn't have a lot going on. It was an in-service day. So we knew we were hopeful that we weren't going to get a lot of calls and that we were going to be able to go through the red team. Now the red team was me, okay? I was the red team. The blue team was, I have a network administrator and 2 system administrators and the supervisor of technology operations. So the blue team was 4 people and I was the red team. So they were working together, and the way that I kicked it off for them was I knew that if I started laterally scanning across segments, that our network administrator would get a net flow alert, okay, that someone was pinging laterally across our network. So by design, I was very loud in pinging across our network so that our network administrator would get that alert. Okay, so that's how the red team kicked off. So they worked through, it probably took about 3 hours. They worked through the 3 hours to identify the device and eventually go out and locate the device and contain it. Okay, part of our, again, we were trying to practice incident response. We were trying to practice the incident response module or model. So part of that is containing the compromised device. So it took them about 3 hours to locate the device and contain it. So some of the lessons learned, interestingly, they initially discovered another device that was talking outside of the network. It was weird traffic. It didn't look like it was a C2, but it looked like it was trying to beacon out. Okay, it looked like it was trying to beacon out of the network. So, okay, it wasn't planned, but it had already paid off. They had discovered another device with weird communications. It reinforced for them, because they don't have an opportunity to do this a lot, it reinforced for them the tools that we have available to us and the logs that we have available to us to locate that compromised device. So the real takeaway for this was, and I kind of knew this, I knew it going into it, but this exercise really reinforced it. We were not doing egress filtering. We were not doing egress filtering. How many people know that they're doing egress filtering? Okay, terrific. So for the rest of you, that's a question that you need to ask. That's a takeaway. Are we doing egress filtering? And if yes, what is it that we're filtering? So from this exercise, you know, it was, yep, we need to start egress filtering. And remember, that's filtering outbound, not just inbound. We're very comfortable with the idea of filtering inbound. We're talking about filtering outbound, and it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. We knew that we needed to continue to work on our IR. We also found that using a timeline for IR was a very good tool for us for our IR exercises, and it was a good team building exercise for that. It's something that they still talk about. Okay, so our second red team, we did 2 last calendar year. It's hard. It's time consuming to set these up. I'm hoping to do 2 a year. You know, it's again, it's really going to how it's going to fit into your work, how often you can do them. But I do recommend that you start. This is our second one. In this particular case, again, we want to practice our incident response. We wanted to. We also wanted to practice what data we needed to collect for our managed service provider in the case of an incident. So our incident service provider, we had further conversations with, our managed service provider. We had further conversation with them and about, you know, if we have an incident and you don't detect it, what is it that you need from us in order to take it for action? And they came up with a list of data points that they wanted us to collect. So that was another one of our goals. Like, what's the data that we need to try to identify to give to our managed service provider so that we can leverage their assistance in case of an incident. Again, identifying C2 covert channels, again, what keeps me up at night. Determine lateral movement and test our managed service, our managed security service provider. Okay, so in this particular case, I used a tool called DNS-CAT. And this is it's along the same lines. It's C2. It's, again, egress filtering, but it has there's a couple different ways you can do it. It has a little twist. So just to talk about DNS, and DNS is port 53, usually UDP port 53. I can assure you, you have it open. You may have TCP port 53 open. That's for some situations with DNS. DNS-CAT2 is able to communicate directly to a DNS server on the internet, or it can communicate through your DNS server. So like I said, there's a little twist to this one. It has a Linux and a Windows PowerShell client, which it also brings an interesting dynamic to this. It allows arbitrary commands, upload, download files. It provides a shell. Basically, once you're on the machine, you can control the machine. But it's very noisy. It polls every minute. So just a quick DNS refresher. You know that I type in something like techtalklive.org. That's going to go to a DNS server. That DNS server is going to resolve it to an IP address and send that back. Your machine receives that IP address and then says, I want to go to that IP address, and then you receive back whatever it is that you're looking for. So there's this constant communication back and forth when you're trying to go someplace. And it's the DNS servers that are constantly mapping that name to IP address. I had mentioned that DNS-CAT can work a couple different ways. So the client can go directly to a DNS server. So what does that mean? If you have egress filtering, but you're still allowing port 53, my client can, the DNS client can communicate directly through port 53 to my DNS-CAT server that's acting like a DNS server. Now, let's say that your egress filtering is granular enough that your firewall says, I will only allow port 53 from my DNS servers. Does anyone know if their egress filtering is that granular? Okay, one. So let's say that again. If your firewall is configured to only allow DNS from your DNS servers, so that means anything trying to go out, port 53, your firewall will only let it out if it's from your DNS servers. DNS-CAT can still get out. It can still leverage that, and it just sends its traffic right through your DNS server because it looks like a DNS packet. It looks like a DNS query and responds. So just to take a look at that, so in this particular case, I configured DNS-CAT to be unencrypted and go directly to the DNS server. So in this case, I said, I want you to go directly to this specific DNS server, which I blanked out there. It's my real server, and I'm a little nervous about sharing that real server with this crowd. But in this case, it's unencrypted. And I did that for a reason, because I wanted you to see, you can actually see in the query the hex. And that little slice of highlighted red hex is actually the command that I typed in from the DigitalOcean command line. Okay, so I typed in, whoami. That's the hex for it. So it's actually in the DNS. In this case, it's a response. So let's another look at that. It's basically, I don't know if it's the same packet, but no, I think it is the same packet. So take a look at this. You can see in the answer from my DNS server, the DNS-CAT server, and again, I did this unencrypted so I could do this. that little bit of hex there is actually the command. So I'm sending back in the answer to the DNS query, who am I? And the response came back in a DNS packet saying root. Now, DNSCat, by its default configuration, is encrypted. So it's really hard to take that apart. But if you run it unencrypted like I did here, you can take it apart. Here's an this is an encrypted authoritative connection. Take a second to look at that. So in this particular case, 22.2.23 is the client, and it's going to my DNS server 21.1.254, and you can see it's a query, a text query, and it's a fully formed URL. You got all that hex and then .enumlab.net. That's a fully formed URL. Okay, so in this particular case, the DNS client is saying to my local DNS server, hey, where can I map the IP address for me for BB780? It's just a lot of, it looks like a lot of garbage there. Okay, but that's actual communication with the command and control server. This is hard. This is hard stuff to figure out. So like, you mean to tell me that someone's communicating command and control through what appears to be a real DNS query and answer? Yes, that's what I'm telling you. Okay, that's what I'm telling you, that there could be command and control through a real DNS query and response. It's hard to detect, very hard to see. As a result of this, we've started sending our DNS logs to our managed service provider, okay, with the objective of saying, how do we see packets like this? Or how do we see requests like this? How do we see DNS traffic like this, where it's a bunch of garbage in the request? Okay, so in this particular red team, again, we scheduled it for a good day where we knew that we weren't going to be real busy and we could sit down and work through this. I had very specific rules of engagements. Don't move to containment until we fully understand the compromise. Because I was trying to open up a channel that was direct, and that was easy to see because it was just going directly to port 53, and one that was authoritative, which I will tell you I was having trouble keeping up. But that was going through the DNS server. So I knew I had two command and control channels, but I wanted them to be able to find that. So I told them very specifically, don't move to containment until you fully understand what's going on. It kicked off with me using PowerShell. Okay, I found a little configuration error in PowerShell. And what's really makes me nervous about this is, when you pull down the DNSCat client for PowerShell, it's not like you download something and then have to execute it. When it downloads it in PowerShell, it automatically uses it. There's no additional you don't really have to do anything other than run what comes down, and it's all inside of PowerShell. Immediately after that, I downloaded PS Exact, which is a Microsoft tool, but I knew that that would trigger an alarm in our antivirus. And then I started lateral scanning again, knowing that it would cause alarms. Lesson learned, we found that bad configuration in our Windows client, the permitted elevated permission for PowerShell. And by the way, I was doing this all without using admin. Okay, I was doing all this without using administrative permissions. It was all just using user permissions. That was my part in the red team, right? Like, I'm not going to use my elevated permissions to work around the work that you've already done. I'm going to use user permissions as it's configured. Okay, we identified the need to collect DNS logs. We identified the need to develop some sort of triggers on this type of communication, the C2. We identified the need for egress filtering for port 53 from just our DNS servers. Again, continuing to develop our IR procedures, and again, another team building experience. I don't know that they'll tell you that, but I thought it was a good team building experience. All right. So the work isn't over with an IR. When you go through a red team, you want to start asking a lot of similar questions that I was asking earlier. What were the indicators of compromise? What are the root causes that we can fix? What skills do we need to continue working on and get better at? Remember, this is about skill building. This isn't about finding misconfigurations. This is about skill building your team or yourself. And again, back to the IR, what procedures do we need to develop and improve? This is actually just our lesson learned from our IR procedure. These are the questions that we ask after one of our red team exercises or an actual IR. Okay, where to start? Start simple. Okay, if you're not familiar with this at all, start simple. Okay, number one, ask, what do we want to allow out? If it's command and control that keeps you up at night, ask, what is it that we want to allow out of our network? Do we want egress filtering, and do we want to allow it out? I was speaking to a colleague who works at higher education, and he simply said, I can't do egress filtering. I'm not permitted to do egress filtering because of academic needs. So they had already crossed this bridge and said, we can't do it. But ask yourself, what kind of egress filtering you want to do, and then start from there. This is actually boundary defense, command and control. This is another good takeaway. If you're not familiar with the 20 critical controls, the CIS 20 critical controls, I would definitely look into this. It's a great framework for figuring out what you need to do to defend your networks. And this is simply asking, what do you want to allow out? Okay. Again, keeping it simple, start simple, okay? So for $5, you can buy a DigitalOcean server. For free, you can download PuTTY if you're a Windows user. Mac, certainly the terminal has SSH. Linux has SSH. Setting up that SSH connection to an external server, not hard, okay? The hard part starts when you start asking, what logs do I have that I can find this connection? That's where the work starts. What logs do I have that I can find this connection outside of my network? Another quote, like I said, I like quotes. The more I practice, the luckier I am, okay? Practice, practice, practice. It's what we need to do in order to become better defenders. And the more you practice, the easier these things get. And the more likely you are to be successful in defending your network and not called by an outside agency saying, hey, by the way, there's been somebody in your network for 83 days. Okay, do I have time for questions? If there are any questions.
So for the DNS thing, have you looked at any products that you could run on your network that would detect that? And if so, how well do they work? I'm thinking like Infoblox has a product that'll do that, Cisco Umbrella, and there's others.
No, we haven't. But thank you for the tip.
I'm just curious if they actually work, because I don't know that answer.
I don't. Like I said, the steps we took was to start sending our DNS logs to our managed service provider, and we're working with them to work out triggers. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
What was the configuration error that you had that allowed you to elevate to PowerShell?
I think it's bypass. Like you can actually. Yes. Thank you.
You can also do an echo, pipe it right into there as well too, and that'll bypass it.
Other questions? All right. Well, thank you for sharing your morning with me. Thank you.